Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Tracy Cook, and I'm the online media manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Managing Change in Your Project Requirements. Today's featured speaker is Nathan Reddy, COO and co-founder of TraceCloud. Nathan has a BS in computer science and an MBA from UC Berkeley. He has over 25 years of experience at firms like Cisco, Intuit, and NetApp, and has led large engineering projects at these organizations. He has a passion for requirement management and traceability. Nathan lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with his wife, 2 kids, and a dog. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the GoToWebinar software. We would like to say thank you to TraceCloud for sponsoring today's event. Nathan, welcome.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everybody to this webinar. Let's dive right in. So you are attending this webinar probably because you're a business analyst, you're dealing with a project with multiple stakeholders, requirements, dependencies. So probably you probably see this every day, that change is the only constant in your project, right? Things are changing all the time. You need a process to manage that change. So the big question that arises for us is, how do we manage the change? Do we lock it down so that change is kind of very hard to make, but the system gets built? Or do we make it very collaborative, but we have a process that helps manage change? And do we have a process that everybody understands how things can work? So let's do a quick poll on this. Perfect. So we see that the results are like about 50% of you have a well-defined process in a tool, but about 44% feel that you don't actually have a tool or a process. And about 4% of you say the current process is to lock things down. So it's kind of hard to make the change. So roughly about 50% of the audience can use a well-defined process. So today you probably, if you look at this picture, you probably have your requirements in Excel and maybe some Word documents. But the challenge you run into is you have multiple stakeholders that need to interface with those requirements. So you may have customers, employees, vendors, testers, partners. And what that leads to is chaos, because you have multiple people touching the same set of documents. You lose control over who has made those changes. And then the information flow is not very well defined. For example, if you have a requirement in a certain row in an Excel file, how does it connect to every other requirement that it needs to work with? So what you ideally need is kind of a centralized repository, right? That gives you a good requirements management process. So one more poll, please, just to kind of see how well the process is defined in your organization. Perfect. I think this is kind of in line with our previous poll, right? About 50% of you feel that, well, there is a centralized database tool and a well-defined process that you use. Roughly 50% of you feel that, well, we still use Excel and Word documents. And that's traditionally what I've seen in the industry too. Yeah, and you'll notice that if you're using Excel and Word, you run into some of the problems I'm going to cover in the next slide. So let's go back to the slide. So here are the challenges that you probably are very familiar with. You don't have a centralized source of truth. Who owns that Excel file? Where is that Word document sitting? Is a challenge you run into. You don't have a centralized process. Every time you start a new project, you have to retrain the team on what exactly is the process you follow. It doesn't really scale. It might work if your team has 3 or 4 or 5 members, but at a certain point, if you have 20 or 30 members or 50 or 100, it becomes difficult to manage. You don't have change control. I'm looking at a requirement in a Word document or an Excel file. Am I looking at the first version of it or the 10th version of it? What changes have been made to this requirement before I got to it, right? Too many files flying around. Who has the latest copy of the file? There is no way to prove end-to-end traceability. How do you take a business requirement, break it down to a functional, non-functional requirement that gets broken further down into your test cases and test results, and be able to prove that you have this daisy chain of dependencies that are all well managed. Again, not easy to use, right? There's no single pane of glass dashboard that you can report on that says, how is this release progressing? How is this feature being implemented? Are there any dangling orphan requirements? You don't have a way to automatically identify suspect requirements. Obviously, baselining is hard. You don't have a way to version requirements. So these are all the challenges that you run into if you're typically dealing with your requirements in a Word or an Excel file. So the solution to this obviously is to have a project structure. You need something that says, when I hire a new engineer or when my experienced team member has left for another opportunity and I hired somebody else, how do I not lose all the tribal information that is there, not start from scratch every time? What does the project structure look like? How can my team members control and collaborate in a controlled way? I want to kind of give them the flexibility to modify things, but at the same time, I need some kind of a control. I want certain groups of people to modify certain sets of data. And at the same time, I don't want them making so much change that they've shot themselves in the foot. I want a flexible process. I don't want everything that says you must do things in a way, because my organization has already figured out how to manage the project. It's just that we want a tool that adapts to that process. And how do we do traceability? So generally, if you're dealing with Excel and Word documents, these are the things that you need to solve. And next slide, please. And one way to solve that is, like 50% of the audience has already some framework to use a requirements management database tool, right? There are multiple products out there. IBM Doors comes to mind. Trace Cloud tries to do what IBM Doors does, but at a lower price and a simpler user interface. But the idea here is whichever tool you use, it should support some best practices. And that means your requirements, while giving you the ability to work with Excel or Word kind of a framework, be able to exist in a framework that lets your different stakeholders interface with it, but provide you a common structure, lets you collaborate, gives you control, have some kind of an approval workflow, be able to do end-to-end traceability and control change. So my recommendation here is for you to move away from Excel and Word towards any easy to use tool that lets you kind of gives you these process and controls so you can get best of both worlds. So let's do a quick poll out here again. Perfect. So this is overwhelming, right? So looks like 98% of you, close to 100% of you, if you had an easy to use tool that defines a well-defined process, it would definitely help you, and you'd love to use something that's kind of both easy to use and, of course, not overwhelming overhead and doesn't cost too much. Those are the things you probably look for as part of that. Sounds good. So let's go to the next slide where we talk about, now we're going to get closer to the demo, right? So we call this the 10 steps to sanity. If you take away one concept from this webinar, it is that here are the 10 steps that if you followed them, doesn't matter which tool you use, but if you followed these, it gives you some kind of a structure to your project. So step one is you need to organize your requirements into different types of requirements. You might already do it. For example, you have an Excel file for business requirements, another Excel file or a tab for your functional, another for non-functional, security, right? The way we think of requirement types is it's a set of requirements that are kind of owned on and worked by a group of people. They have their own attributes that might be relevant to them. Like, for example, a business requirement might have an attribute called cost or a delivery date, whereas your non-functional requirement might have an attribute called implementation type, right? So the idea is each type has its own types of attributes that you track, and they may have their own approval workflows, right? So you need to organize your requirements into types. But within the type of requirement, you may have hundreds or thousands of requirements. So you want to be able to categorize them further and organize them into folders. For example, if you look at your File Explorer in Windows or Finder in Mac, you would organize your documents into folders and subfolders to make sense of them. Similarly, You don't want to just dump thousands of requirements of one type in one place. If you had a good folder structure, it helps you, or it helps any new hire come up to speed fast. That's part of your process. Once you define your requirement types and you define your folders and subfolders, you want to be able to import them in an easy manner. So if you have Excel or Word, find a tool or system that lets you import and export back into Excel and Word easily. The next step is to have roles and change control mechanism. All members of a project aren't the same. You have business analysts, you have dev managers, you have validators, you have customers, you may have partners and vendors. So they all need to be working. Think of them as multiple cooks in the same kitchen, but they're all working on different pieces of the puzzle. And then when they all have their own defined roles and safety mechanisms, the whole dish comes out really well. Okay. The next step is to create traceability. This is the ability to connect a requirement to its downstream and upstream dependencies. And the idea of traceability is once you make those connections, the system should be able to do a lot of grunt work for you. For example, let's say you have a process requirement that says, I don't want to see any business requirements that do not have any downstream requirements. We call them dangling requirements. Or I do not want to see any test cases that are not testing anything. We call them, say, orphan test cases. Or let's say I have a business requirement and I've given them to my engineering team and they have their functional requirements tied to my business requirement. If I were to change my mind and modify my business requirement, the system should automatically identify the change in terms of, say, suspect traces and let people know that there is something you're working on based on an assumption that might have changed. Please go fix the assumption. So that's where traceability comes into play. And I'll talk more about it when I go into the demo. Then you want to be able to visualize your end-to-end traceability. For example, if you're building a product for FDA, for example, you need to get FDA approval, or you're building a spaceship. You want to be sure that by the time your product goes live or your rocket launches, you have looked at your requirements from beginning all the way down the chain and be certain that there were no suspect changes. There were no dangling requirements in the flow. So that's your end-to-end traceability. Then you need a system that gives you a single pane view. For example, you could say, show me all the requirements that I own and give me warranty or guarantee that they're all clean. Or show me all the requirements of a certain feature and its downstream requirements. Give me confidence that there are no suspect traces there, right? You want a system that gives you approval workflow. For example, if I were to make a change, am I authorized to make the change? Has the change been digested by downstream teams and has been approved by the right people in the organization? Right? One of the concept is baselining. That is, when I talk to a customer in the first of the month, I gave them a snapshot of what the work looks like right now. So 6 months later, when things have changed, I can always compare against the baseline and say, here's the delta between what we agreed to and what it looks like right now. And the last point is you need a way to version your requirements, be able to track the changes, be able to kind of see an audit log, because you do want to have a single source of truth. And you can always go back to it and say, this is what it looked like. This is what we agreed to. This is the new change, and the change has been digested. So these are the 10 steps to sanity, and I'll try to cover them in my demo. So with that, I will share my screen and go to my browser. Tracy, can I get the permission to share my screen?
There you go, Nathan.
Thank you. So let's talk about requirement types. I have multiple projects here. For example, let's say I'm a systems engineering project and I want to kind of follow the INCOSE process. I may have stakeholder requirements. I may have system element requirements, system element verification. Whereas I'm following, let's say, the IIBA template, I may have business requirements, design, interface requirements. If I'm following, here's a demo we did recently for a manufacturing OEM called Magna. They had OEM requirements, right? So the idea here is whichever tool you use, it should let you define your own requirement types and not say you can only use epics and stories and tasks. It should be able to say, well, I have a process that requires OEM requirements and I can create OEM requirements, right? So I have another demo project out here. You can see I have lots of different types of requirements. So with Trace Cloud, you can define your own requirement types, and each requirement type can further be organized into folders and subfolders. For example, in my IABA template, I have business requirements that are broken down into multiple subfolders. Whereas if I go to my InCozy, if I look at my stakeholder requirements, I have different stakeholders. They're all stakeholder requirements. They're all the same type of requirements. They all have the same structure, same attributes, similar behavior. It's just that they're organized for better management into folders and subfolders. So have a tool that lets you do that, lets you define requirement types. Within the requirement types, lets you define your attributes. And then within those attributes, after that, you can define your folders and subfolders. Once you do that, yes, step number 3 is to be able to import your legacy requirements into the system. Ideally, you're looking for something that lets you import from Excel. So you should be able to say, I already have a lot of requirements in my Excel files. I want to be able to import from an Excel file, right? You should be able to say, here, I have a file. I'm going to quickly kind of do that for you as a demo. I can pick all these files in this Excel file, just upload them for me and create new requirements. And it should be able to go through that Excel file, identify the column names of the Excel file, and map it to whatever attributes are defined for this requirement type. And you should be able to press this button. It should be able to just go and say, fine, I'll go and create the requirements for you, right? So in this case, I just went in and created some 20 odd requirements that were there in the system. And now I have those new requirements in here. So the takeaway here is have a tool that lets you define your project structure and lets you easily import requirements into your system. So now that you have your requirements in the system, the next step is defining roles and permissions. Like I said, this project may have multiple stakeholders, and the stakeholders are working in the same kitchen. You don't want people stepping on each other's toes and messing up the dish. So the best way to do that is to define a concept of roles. And in this case, when I go to the folder permissions, it tells me that I am a member of these roles. Here are what members of different roles can do on this folder. So you should be able to define roles and permissions at a granular level. It should be able to say, well, business analysts focusing on Apple should be able to get to the customer requirements of Apple, and they should be able to modify and create requirements. But a test engineer, they can probably read the requirements, but they should not be able to modify a customer requirement. So you want a system that gives you that level of flexibility. Okay, so now we have defined your project structure, your requirement types, your folders, your imported requirements, and you've got kind of some kind of an permission structure, and people can start working on it. Let's jump into traceability, right? So this is where when you create your requirements for the first time, they are called Orphan requirements, and they're also dangling. That means they do not have a parent or they do not have a child. So if you open this requirement from a traceability perspective, it's Orphan and dangling. This is where you can start connecting this requirement to other requirements. For example, I can say this customer requirement is going to be implemented in release 1, and it's going to be part of release 2 also. And it is actually executed by these business requirements in this folder. So I can say, for example, BR 175.1 and 175.11 are actually what's implementing on this customer requirement. And you can label these traces. So at this point, what I've done is I have not only imported and created requirements, I was able to connect them to other objects in the project. The beauty of this is once this happens, if this requirement were to ever get modified, for example, let's say I modified the business requirement, should not be able to, it's a big change. If I were to make this change, what you'll see automatically is the relationship between this requirement and its upstream and downstream starts showing up in red, we call that a suspect trace. Okay. That means the person who owns this requirement will know that their relationship to an upstream requirement is suspect and they need to resolve that. And anytime you see those, that means the product is being built with, I would say, flux in the system that has not been handled well. One other thing you want to look at is any tool that you use should make it easy for you to work with large sets of data. For example, you may want to do something called a trace matrix, which is show me the relationship between data in a certain folder. For example, show me how all my business requirements of Apple are connected to my customer requirements of Apple, and show that information to me in a matrix format. Most of you might be familiar with this framework. It has been there in the industry for a long time, but just that they were difficult to use in the past, we try to make it really easy to work with. So you could say, for example, this BR4059.1 from that folder is applicable to the CR552. I can just create that trace out here. Or if I see the suspect trace, I can go and clear that. If I think this link is no longer relevant, I can delete it. So it's interactive. A trace tree, trace matrix format where you can bring in data from any two folders and connect them. For example, you might say, I want to connect my functional requirements of Apple to my business requirements of Apple, and I would like to see them in a matrix format and be able to kind of work with them directly here, right? So you should be able to do that. Or you can say this functional requirement is applicable to all these business requirements. Please connect them in one shot. Or this business requirement is applicable to all the functional requirements. Please work with me. So these matrices help you visualize and make these changes easily. So once you build this daisy chain of requirements, the benefit of that is you should be able to look at any requirement and start seeing the multi-level traceability tree. So even though we connected the CR to the BRs, because the business requirements are further downstream connected, now you can see a hierarchy that's being built out. And you can see where the change is in the system that has not been accepted, where there are dangling requirements, orphan requirements. Now, with any system that you use, ideally you want a dashboarding ability. You should be able to say, show me the health of this folder, show me how many requirements there are, show me how many are in various stages of traceability. For example, how many are dangling, how many are orphan, how many have suspects, or we'll come to approval workflow later. But the idea here is you want to be able to check on the health of any folder at a point in time and say, give me the health of all the requirements in this folder. Now, if you're using Excel or Word, it's difficult to get to this level of automated metrics. You can get the same information at a product level, at a release level, right? Just want to show you one aspect of it. So now that we talked about single pane of glass, we talked about traceability, we talked about traceability tree, the last piece of the puzzle is approval workflow, which is who gets to make these changes, and when they make those changes, who gets to approve them, right? So any system that you use should make it easy for you to configure that, where you can say, I want members of this role, all members to approve first, followed by this role and this role and this role, and then the requirement gets to its final approved state. So for example, if I'm looking at this requirement, it starts in a draft state. I can submit it for approval. Once I submit it for approval, it automatically enters the approval workflow. And the system should give me the flexibility to define which roles need to approve first and next for any specific folder, because your requirements could be different for each of those folders. For example, you may have a scenario where you want the customer requirements to be approved by the product managers and then maybe a representative of the customer and maybe a vendor, whereas you want your functional requirements to be approved just by your engineering team, or you want your test cases to be approved by your product management team and your business analyst team. So the system should give you the flexibility to approve requirements. But it's very important to realize that when you're looking at a requirement, every requirement has a versioning ability, because when you go through an approval workflow, you're typically approving a certain version of that requirement. So for example, this requirement has gone through multiple versions because every time the name or description changed, the system created a new version. And when you do that modification, then essentially what you need to do is you need to say, I need to get approval for that version of that requirement. Okay. Or when you go to a different requirement, for example, it's in draft mode, it's at V3. If it gets modified, it gets reset back to draft and you have to go through approval workflow. So these are the 10 steps. And just to reiterate, when you look for a system to manage change, make sure it can let you define your requirement types. Within the requirement types, it lets you define your folders. It lets you easily import your requirements into the system. After that, you can define roles and control what members of that role can do in that folder. Then you can easily do traceability, where you can connect one requirement to another requirement to another requirement. Then you can view the data in a trace matrix format, a trace tree format. The system should be able to automatically identify suspect requirements for you. That's where a change has been made that has not been digested by downstream teams. You should be able to send it through an approval workflow to make sure the right people have made the change, and then followed by have a versioning and audit trail system so that you have the single source of truth. So that's a demo about those 10 steps to sanity. With that, let's go back to the PowerPoint. And once the PowerPoint comes up, we'll flash through next few slides because I already covered them in the demo. So reiterating, step 1, organize your requirements into type. Step 2, right? You want to be able to organize your data within the requirement type into folders, subfolders, and subfolders. So it's easy to kind of visualize and make sense of large sets of requirements that you have. Step 3 is going to be, you want it to be easy for you to import data from Excel, and then you want to be able to modify the data using an easy to use interface. Once you do that, you also want to make sure the system lets you define roles, and the roles should let you give you granular permissions where you can say members of this role on this folder can create, read, update, delete, trace, approve requirements, and you get to control who gets to do what in which area of your project. By the way, just as a kind of a small pitch for us, we are available if you need to kind of go deeper into the demo, or if you want to have a custom project set up for you that shows how your process maps within Trace Cloud. We'll be very happy to help you define your requirements management plan and set up a demo project. I'm sure you're aware of the term RMP. This defines how the process that you want to use to manage your requirements. Those are the 10 steps I talked about. What are your requirement types? What are your folders? How do you plan to do traceability? What are the different roles? What permissions do they have? What are the reports that you want to use? How do you plan to baseline? So that kind of put together into a document is known as a requirements management plan. And we'll help you define that and set up a demo project. Just need to drop a note to support@tracecloud.com. So the next step we had was traceability, right? So you need to have an easy to use tool that lets you say, okay, I have requirements in a folder that are owned by a business analyst. I have requirements in another folder that are owned by the engineering manager or owned by the test analyst team. I want to be able to connect them in an easy to use system. So we call that a trace matrix. You could use that to build those daisy chains. Once different stakeholders create those chains, for example, the business analyst has talked to the product manager, they have connected their work to the engineering teams, which have connected their work to the test cases, you can build something called a trace tree, which is a hierarchical daisy chain that shows how one requirement has gotten broken up into multiple sub requirements, and more importantly, where there is change in these requirements that has not been digested. The example I give is, let's say you go to a pond of water and it's calm, and somebody throws a stone into it. Think of that as your project, which is everything is fine, we are all agreed to one thing, and then a client or somebody modified a requirement. The ripples in that pond that you see is the change that requirement modification has caused in your project. As those ripples go out, how do they impact everything else that they're connected to? And has that impact been digested? That's what those green and red arrows are. The red arrows are where the impact was felt but has not been digested by that particular owner of that requirement. When they digest it and they make the arrow green, you know that they have digested it, and then the ripple has passed them. So you need a good system that lets you visualize and gives you confidence that when I'm going live with my feature or a product or deploying something to customer, I know that all the changes have been digested by the appropriate stakeholders. Okay. This is what I talked about the dashboard, right? So it should be able to show you either at a folder level or at an owner level or at a project level, what are the different metrics that you need to be aware of to know that you have confidence in your project. How does my traceability look? Do you have any open dangling requirements? Do you have any open orphans? Do you have suspects? Do I need to kind of approve any requirements that need my approval? And how are they doing from a testing perspective? So you need a system that gives you a dashboard at multiple layers of the product, so you can see where the problem is and how you can fix it. We talked about approval workflow. So for example, when your requirements change, that change needs to be approved by the right authorized role members. There's no predefined hard and fast rule as to who defines or who approves those role requirements. So the system should give you the flexibility to define roles, add members, and set those roles in a sequence so they can actually go through an approval process. You might say, like I explained before, if a customer requirement gets modified, I want the product manager, the customer's representative, and the vendor to approve them in this sequence. Or you might say, if a business requirement gets modified, I want the dev manager to approve it first and then followed by the VP of engineering. So you should be able to set your own approval workflow, and the system should pretty much run an autopilot after that. Baselines. So this is the concept where you can take a snapshot of a set of requirement at a certain point in time and then be able to say, okay, what has changed since we took the baseline? Or how can I compare multiple baselines and see how does the baseline I took in January versus how does the baseline I took in December, how do they differ, right? So you want to use a system that gives you that flexibility, because quite often, I'm sure you've been in these conversations where the client or the vendor is saying, well, why have the dates changed, or what caused the delay in the project, or how can we avoid this in the future? And then you need to be able to compare and say, instead of it being a he said, she said, you can pull out a baseline report and say, this is what we agreed to, and this is the delta since agreement, therefore there is a cost to it. So again, whatever tool you use should support audit trail and versioning. Audit trail is every single change that has happened to the requirement. Versioning is more a higher grade changes that you can define and say, anytime a name or a description or some critical attribute is modified, I want a new version to be created. It's important to note that versioning is what's connected to approval workflow. You don't want to overwhelm the system by requiring approval every time a small change has been made, but only when kind of versions of the requirement has changed. So the system should support that. So just to kind of talk to this concept, right? So your starting point is you define a structure for your project, import your requirements, trace them, set up access roles, and then when you want to modify a requirement, how does that work, right? So if you go to this next slide, right? The first thing is, do you have permission to make the change? Like we said, we don't want everybody and anybody to be able to change any requirement, because then it becomes too much chaotic, right? So you want to be able to define roles. Only certain roles can make changes. Then you want to be able to see the impact of the change. Like when I make this change, how many upstream, downstream requirements is it going to touch? You want to know who gets modified when the change happens. You want to know, is it logged? Is there a new version that gets created? You want to know who gets to approve the next version. You want to know the upstream, downstream impact, and will they digest the change? Have they digested the change, right? How does the change show up in different dashboards? How will it get resolved, right? How can I report on this change? So I'll do a quick demo to kind of walk you through that so you can see the impact of that. Can I quickly share my screen for a quick second? Tracy, thank you. like I talked about earlier, right? So if I need to, now that I have kind of imported my requirements, I've connected everything, if I need to modify this requirement like I showed earlier, right? You should be able to see easily in a traceability chart, how is this requirement connected to upstream and downstream requirements? You should be able to quickly kind of go and kind of investigate this further and say, well, when I look at this requirement, I know it's connected to these business requirements. What do they have downstream of them? Or what do these requirements have downstream of them, right? So you should be able to investigate and see the impact of modifying this requirement on other things in the system. Then you should be able to see, for example, if you're looking at this particular folder of requirements, what is the approval cycle after I modify the requirement? Who needs to approve it? It looks like the business analyst and the product marketing and the product managers. It is likely to go through approval cycle. And then after you modify that, what you should be able to see is kind of look at the folder metrics to see how many of the changes that you have made have been digested by upstream and downstream teams, how they've been approved, right? So these are all the things that the system should be able to help you manage. And then your goal essentially is you should have zero requirements with suspect downstreams and suspect upstreams in your folder. When you get to that point, you know that everything that you own is clean, and when the product gets deployed, there won't be any surprises at the end of it. So my recommendation for any teams that are currently using Excel and Word or using a tool too is, initially when it looks overwhelming, where you're like, oh my God, there's so much that we need to change, my recommendation is to do baby steps. Based on my experience dealing with lots of customers who have taken this journey, is if you look at my step one is, I'm going to spend a week and define the project structure. I'm going to define my RMP. And I'm going to kind of a week or two later, I will be able to import my existing legacy requirements into Excel and Word. And then my team can actually comment, collaborate, and work in the single source of truth. That's a milestone by itself, right? And then the next few steps for you is I can easily generate the reports I want. I can trace requirements. I'm able to identify where there are dangling and orphan and suspect requirements. And more importantly, I can prove end-to-end traceability. That's a milestone, right? And then you can define your change management approval process and operationalize dashboards. That's like, so this entire thing shouldn't take you more than, like, you should start seeing positive benefits within the first 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that, and then 2 weeks after that. If you take this kind of incremental proof of value to your process, any tool that you use will be beneficial. I would highly like to pitch for TraceCloud because that's what I'm very familiar with. And a lot of emphasis has gone on making it kind of easy to use and take this journey one step at a time. So just a quick blurb about TraceCloud. We've been around since 2009. We're San Francisco Bay Area based. 15,000 plus users use it. We are present on Captera. We have good reviews there. We are used mostly in large civil engineering projects, systems engineering companies, medical device manufacturers, people that have a real need for tightly managing a good requirements management flow are the ones that kind of use it. Here's one benefit for you, an offer we're giving is, if you want to use TraceCloud for attending this webinar, you can get 6 months of free usage for your team. We hope you can complete one successful project in that time. You also can leverage 10 hours of consulting time from us. We'll help you, like I said, set up your requirements management plan, maybe train your team, and set up a demo project or set up your template project that kind of maps it. So there is practically no risk or expectation or obligation from our side. You can leverage it for free. We hope you can make use of it. Just drop a note to support@tracecloud.com, or if you want to reach out to me, Nathan@tracecloud.com. I'm available there too.
Excellent. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for that great presentation today. As a reminder, we're going to go into the question period, so you still have time to type your questions into the questions box. Nathan, we do have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to jump right in. Our first question, can these requirements map to a delivery method, say one using epics or stories?
And the answer is yes. We have customers who define requirement types called epics and stories, and they're able to trace from an epic to a story to a lot of your functional, non-functional requirements. and be able to track them from that perspective? So the answer is yes.
Thank you. Our next question, is there a way to connect this to Jira or Rally?
Yes, we have a solid integration with Jira. The reason why we have that is a lot of our customers are systems engineering customers who do their software development in Jira. That's where the process and the issues are in Jira. But their hardware system validation, that's all they still need a place to keep it. So they use Trace Cloud for their systems, hardware, non-software requirements, but they keep their issues and software requirements in Jira, and that those requirements from Jira flow into Trace Cloud as proxy objects. So they're available from a reporting perspective. That integration is tight and pretty heavily used. We do not have a very good integration with Rally other than you can link to Rally requirements using URL type attributes or import them. But if it's a need for you, we can implement it because we've already done that for Jira. So it should be pretty straightforward to do it for Rally too.
Thanks, Nathan. Our next question, do you link non-functional requirements to thousands of requirements, or do they stay above all other requirements?
Can you repeat the question again,
I
Tracy?
can, and maybe we need, I'll repeat it, and maybe you need it to be retyped. Do you link non-functional requirements to thousands of requirements, or do they stay above all other requirements?
Makes sense. So the great thing is, from a process perspective, the tool lets you do what works for you. For example, I have seen some projects where they are like, I have, say, for example, compliance requirements that are going to stay above all these requirements, and different requirements connect to them. And I've seen people say, my business requirement needs to break down into functional and non-functional requirements. The great thing with Trace Cloud is, while you organize your requirements in folders and subfolders, that's a physical location, the traceability is very dynamic. So you could take a requirement and connect it to any requirement anywhere in the project, and the trace tree is able to dynamically build a report for you and pull the connected requirements together. So you could use either model. I've seen people who have compliance and other non-security requirements sitting at a high level with downstream requirements that are connected to them. I've seen people who say, I'm going to take a business requirement, break it into sub-functional, non-functional, and store them below that. Both models work.
Thank you, Nathan. Our next question, do you recommend using your tool if the client wants to track line item requirements, but also use user stories?
Yes. Like this is similar to the first question, where you can define any type of object in Trace Cloud. So for example, if the client is saying, I want a high level requirement, and that's all I care about, you can define the requirement type in Trace Cloud. And then within that, you can create your own granular requirements, your line requirements that are traced up to those clients' requirements. And then anytime you want to report to the client, you can say, here are your high level requirements and the downstream work of all of that put together in one place. Or you could just focus just on your line requirements during your execution. But the data is connected and you can pull up whichever report you want.
Thanks, Nathan. Our next question, what about, is this for academic usage?
Yes, it's available for academic usage at a kind of greatly discounted price. So please reach out to support@tracecloud.com. We should be able to take care of you.
Great. Our next question, we are worried about too many users making uncontrolled change. Can you define granular access control? For example, control who gets to do what in each folder and how?
Yes, so we have that flexibility where you can define roles, and a role can control what happens in a folder, but we go one step deeper. It's not just can you create requirements in a folder, can you modify or delete? You can also control which attributes of that requirement can this role modify. So for example, let's say you had an attribute called delivery date. You want everybody to create requirements, but you want only business analysts to be able to modify the delivery date attribute. You can control it at that level too.
Great. Our next question, how is approval workflow used in real life?
So the classic example is, let's say I'm working on a medical device product, and when any requirement gets modified, that's a business requirement gets modified, One of my vendors, let's say the device I'm making, I have a first customer, which is a big hospital. I want one of their representatives to approve that change, but I don't want to overwhelm them. So what I do is I have multiple layers ahead of it. I might say my business analyst, my product manager, my VP of engineering. I want the requirement to clear these three approvals before I bother the customer. So you can define it so that it goes through those gates, and so the right people are kind of notified at the right time for the right change.
Thank you. Next, what is baselining, and can you explain this with an example?
Sure. So baselining is basically, think of it as a point in time snapshot of what the system looks like. Quite often, your project goes through certain milestones. Let's say you did something called an execute commit, and you're like, after this date, we're going to start working on this because the requirements are locked and loaded. You kind of can take a snapshot of it, but the idea is things still change after that, right? So you want to be able to kind of go back to the execs once every month and say, well, this is what we committed to on January 1st. Now this is February 1st. This is what we have changed since that date. So think of baselining as a snapshot of a set of data at a point in time with the ability to report on it, report on the changes that have happened since the snapshot was taken.
Great. Next, how long does a team take to be productive with a Trace Cloud project?
So this goes back to the baby steps, right? If let's say your team uses Excel and Word, and you're like, we are very frustrated with it, we don't have a change management process. Within 2 weeks, you should be able to kind of have a requirements management plan, a project structure, be able to import your requirements in, right? Literally 2 weeks after that, your team could be kind of adding requirements, modifying them, collaborating on them, making comments, right? And sending them through a approval workflow. So I would say 4 weeks is the upper end where you can have 80% of the value rolled into it.
Thank you. Our next question. We are a large engineering company and cannot use SaaS. Do you provide an on-premise option?
Yes. So we kind of pretty much give the exact same software. In fact, we have large banking and defense contractors. What they do is they do not want to use a SaaS product for their business needs. So the same software pretty much gets installed at a customer location. We don't recommend trying it if you have less than 20 users. You need about more than 20 users because you own, or your IT team owns, backing up the data and patching it once in a while. So if you have more than 20 users, you're more than welcome to kind of take it on-prem.
Thanks, Nathan. And just a reminder, if you have questions, you still have time to type a few into the questions box. Nathan, our next question. How much does your software cost?
So we have two pricing models. The easiest one to understand is the user-based pricing model. It's $47 per user license. The read-only licenses are a little cheaper, but these licenses are, what do you call them? Named licenses, but they can be redistributed as you need them. So for example, let's say I bought 3 licenses. I gave one to myself, I gave one to Tracy, and I gave one to Chris. Now, if Chris were to leave the organization and John joins, I can just assign it to John, right? They can use unlimited projects, unlimited data with that user license.
Thank you. Our next question. Can you automatically identify all the dangling, orphan, and suspect requirements in the project?
Yes. In fact, not only that, you can do that multiple layers. For example, you can go to a folder and say, get me all dangling, orphan, or suspect requirements in this folder, or get me those in the entire project, or more importantly, get me those for a particular feature. For example, let's say you had an important feature, let's say building a car, and you had a feature called transmission that further broke down into business, functional engineering, security requirements down the chain. You should be able to say, build a daisy chain of every requirement that's connected to the transmission type requirements, and within that set, identify the danglings and orphans and suspects for me, and the system should be able to do that for you.
Great. Next question. Can you explain the difference between versioning and traceability?
Sure. Think of versioning as if you have a row in an Excel file, and that's your requirement. Every time that requirement is changed, you want to create a new version of that requirement. Traceability is if you have multiple requirements in different Excel files and you connected one to another, that connection is traceability. Now, the importance of traceability is if a requirement is modified, means it gets a new version, then the traceability, the connection to other requirements is marked as suspect. That means when you connected a requirement to mine, I was at version 1 and you're fine, you're working on that. When I modified my requirement, I'm in version 2, you need to decide if you need to modify your requirement or my version 2 still works for your requirement, therefore you can just clear the trace between us. So traceability is more the connection aspect of it. Versioning is more the requirement itself.
Thanks, Nathan. I think this is the last question we have. Do you have an integration with Jira? I know you already
Yes, we do.
responded to that, but here's the rest of it. We are a systems company and we track our software requirements, but we would like to a place that tracks hardware and software requirements in one place.
That's exactly the use case we have, and that's what we have the Jira integration for. And that seems to be a pretty relatively common and popular use case because Jira is great for tracking your software workflows and issues and defects and bugs and all that stuff, but it doesn't really do traceability or hardware or systems kind of stuff. So that's where the Trace Cloud and Jira integration comes into play.
Thanks, Nathan. And we do have another question. Importing requirements from Excel looks normal, but how about importing from Word?
Yes, so we have import from Word too. You can do things like, for example, you can search within the Word document for a certain phrase and make the entire paragraph requirement, or more importantly, you can highlight certain parts of the Word document, set a certain style to it. This can recognize those styles and then import the requirements. But because Word is a kind of unstructured document, for lack of a better word, you will need to do a bit of prep work before you can import from Word. But here's the very powerful feature. We have a lot of customers who want to do the reverse, which is they want to generate standardized Word reports in a certain template format where the template gets filled with the data from the database and gets generated into a Word document. One classic example is we have a customer called Purple Line. They're building a metro system in Maryland. And because it's a construction project, they need to take each requirement, print it out in a certain format, and then, I don't know, take a scan of it and save it somewhere or something. But the system is able to generate these custom Word reports for them. So you can do both. You can import from Word and you can also generate Word reports.
Excellent, Nathan, and thank you. You've responded to all of the questions. So Nathan, again, we'd like to thank you for such a great session today, as well as we'd like to thank Trace Cloud for sponsoring today's event. Again, we'd like to thank all of our attendees today as well for joining us. And I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at the ModernAnalyst.com website within a few business days. And this concludes today's event. We hope everyone has a great day. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you.